Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 3 of week 12, which is in continuation of lecture 1 and 2, and the topic of today's lecture or this week's lecture is the notion of postmodernism. So, in this throughout the lecture, we will talk about the various elements of postmodernism in some detail. In our earlier lecture, we have already discussed some of the important elements of postmodernism. In this lecture, we will discuss each point one by one in some detail. The first important theoretical element is truth. Postmodernism or postmodernists are skeptical about the notion of truth and especially singular or unilinear version of truth. Because postmodernists, they believe that modernists have a unitary idea of truth, which means that there is only one particular truth about person or events which they feel is not correct. We have already explained this point to an extent in our earlier lectures, where I have already explained that how the modernists have advocated for a single version or explanation of any event, occurrences, or phenomena in the society. Postmodernists argue that this singular notion of truth is not valid. There are multiple notions of truth, and therefore, it is not possible to accept the modernist version of truth as the only explanation of the world or explanation of social organization. So, therefore, they have argued that there is no one notion of truth but multiple notions of truth. Single understanding of truth may be incomplete and it may promote oppression. Now, this is very important because we have already discussed the notion of partial truth and complete truth with respect to Mahatma Gandhi and also with respect to other Western postmodernist thinkers. And we have seen that how when we possess a certain version of truth, it may not be a complete picturization of what we are studying. Secondly, sometimes in the name of a singular version and calling it a universal version, we try to propagate certain systems, we try to propagate certain thought processes, certain institutional structure, social behavior in the society, which may be oppressive because it may promote the interest of one segment of the society at the cost of others. So, this we have to understand. Second very important aspect is that this singular notion of truth, it leads to exclusion of those who do not believe in that notion. It is exclusive in nature because the person who belong to a particular community or, for example, who belong to the liberal state, they are supposed to hold the actual or the true version of reality. And those who do not believe in the liberal traditions, they are supposed to be outsider or they may be considered indifferent or inferior or they may be ignored also at times. So, it is an exclusionary process which the postmodernists argue is not correct because any notion of truth should be inclusive in nature. It should be such that it could incorporate all the other versions of reality. Postmodernism also draws our attention to who decides what is to call truth. See, what is true and what is false is decided by somebody in the society. They are not given to us by nature. Especially norms about our social behavior, they are developed by human beings. Who decides what is right, what is wrong? Who decides what is ethical and what is not ethical? This is very important for postmodernists because most of the time it has been found that the knowledge is controlled by those who are rich and the powerful. And to protect their own interest, they try to promote a certain version of truth and say that that is the ultimate explanation or the complete and the true explanation of any event or occurrence. So therefore, it is very essential that we know that who is calling or who is telling what is truth or who is building up certain notions of truth. And therefore, they argue that any notion of truth is associated with exercise of power and dominance, the one which I have already explained. We have to understand the hidden forces behind the abstract notion of truth or the innocence of truth. Behind that, there can be many forces or intentions to dominate and to exploit. So, therefore, what is true today may be false tomorrow, it can be challenged, and what is false today may be a truth tomorrow. So, it is highly subjective in nature, it is not constant, it changes with time and situation. Michel Foucault, one of the very important postmodernist thinkers, have argued that truth is relative and gained through a societal process often known as discourse. So, truth is not something which is lying outside the world, something which is external, something which we can deduce in an objective and neutral manner, but it is relative, relative to a particular situation, to a particular circumstances, to a particular occurrence, etc. And this truth is gained through a social process. It is not something which is asocial, but it is gained through a social process which is known as discourse. And what is discourse? Discourse refers to particular critical system and vocabularies that are employed to explain social formation, institutions, and practices. So, it is a set of vocabularies, it is a particular explanation of certain social occurrence, social phenomena or institution or formation. It is a communication also, whether written or unwritten. And such a discourse, it helps in understanding truth about a certain situation or aspects of society. Therefore, postmodernists argue that in the construction of self, the importance of discourse is immense. Because an individual is subjected to multiple discourses as he grows up since his childhood, and discourses influences his personality, his or her thought processes in multiple manner. If you have to understand the identity and thought processes of an individual, you have to understand the various discourses through which he has passed. So therefore, it is not something which is, the truth is something which is objective, which can be understood by being detached from the social reality, but it is very much contingent in nature. It draws from the social reality. So we must understand the specific context or the specific situation from which the truth emerges, and we must then able to understand the real intention or the real components which were responsible for a particular kind of truth or particular type of explanation which are being given. Postmodernists argue that there is not one unitary truth but multiple truths. There cannot be one truth, but there are multiple truths, various ways in which we can understand a phenomena. For example, let us understand this point with the help of an example. How we can establish the distribution of good in a way that it is done in an equitable manner. Or in other words, how to achieve justice in the society. Now, various explanations, various theories have been given by scholars from time to time to explain how the distribution of goods in the society can take place in the best possible way so that a certain equitable distribution is achieved. So there is no one theory, there are multiple theories. So the same objective of distribution of goods or resources in the society is explained by different scholars from a different perspective. So therefore, there is no one reality or there is no one explanation, but multiple explanation. Similarly, when we talk about the well-being of the individual, there are multiple explanations or theories how we can foster the well-being of individuals. So there cannot be one single truth or explanation about how individual well-being will take place. And for that matter, if you take the theory of state, there is no one theory of state. There are so many theories of state. How an ideal state can be established? There is no one theory, but multiple theories to help us in understanding how an ideal state or a strong state can be established. So therefore, there can be multiple visions, multiple pathways, multiple procedures by which we can reach towards the ultimate or true reality. So truth was the first or most important aspect which has been reinterpreted and reconceptualized by the postmodernist by making a critique of the understanding of truth as has been done by the modernist thinkers. Second important feature of postmodernism is language, use of language, very, very important. Why language is important? Because postmodernists argue that language is a powerful medium to construct reality. We use languages in our everyday lives. And through that language, we interpret the world. And with the help of language, we can interpret the world in multiple ways. We can construct the reality in multiple ways. And postmodernists argue that modernism, through the use of language, have created grand ideas and manifestations. Or in other words, they argue that it is not that these grand ideas are already existing there and language is just manifesting it or expressing it. It is not that. These grand ideas are constructed by the use of language, by the use of certain languages. For example, the notion of rational human being or the notion of a state being established through the means of social contract. These all are notions or concepts which are created with the help of language. And they help us in understanding certain processes, certain phenomena in the society. So therefore, language is a very powerful tool because ultimately all the ideas of modernism, all the theories of modernism which the postmodernists are criticizing, those have been created and there the role of language is very important. Further, the postmodernists argue that language has been a weapon to control and dominate. So if language can construct and reconstruct, language can also be used to control. We can use certain languages in a manner that it can manipulate your thoughts. It can manipulate my behavior, or it can be cause a sort of gender discrimination by the particular use of language in the society. It can create an environment of gender discrimination in the society. So language is used to provide a particular interpretation of the world. So how the language is used is very important. We have to be careful. So language is not simply a means of expression. Language is not simply a means of communication where we are simply expressing what we are seeing. No. Postmodernists argue that language is used in a deliberate manner to interpret the world in a certain way that suits the interest of certain segments of the society. It is a deliberate construction of a world. See, this is very important to understand. Because once we try to construct and reconstruct something, we have certain objectives in the mind. And that can be objective to dominate, objective to control, objective to manipulate. And therefore, we want to provide or we want to convey to the people certain interpretation of the world. And we will see in the subsequent slides that how this is done. A very prominent postmodern thinkers, J. Baudrillard, argue that he actually gives the example of media. How media uses images and languages to manipulate us. See, we are bombarded with so much of media images. Now there are so many channels of communication and infinite programs are running 24/7 across the world. We are subjected to multiple images, infinite images. And how the science and the language or the things which we see in media, they control us, they manipulate us. And the most alarming thing which this media has caused, that it has created a virtual reality, which seems to be almost similar to the real world. And in some respect, it has superseded the real world. Because we have seen that media produces images of dream, images of a very good and prosperous, luxurious life, images of certain social system, images of an ideal political system, or it can be any other dream and aspiration which media tries to portray and present before us. And they are very much virtual in nature, they are unreal. But by watching those programs and by continuous watching, we enter that virtual world and try to live with those actors who are acting in those programs. We identify ourselves at some level with those people, believing that they are real. So in many ways, social media have produced images which have superseded the real world. We are living more in the virtual world rather than the real world. And therefore, there is a gap which has been created when we are most of the time living in the virtual world, losing our connection with the real world, leading to lots of despair, frustration, and a sense of a deprivation or pessimism in the human beings. So this is one of the reasons. And we know that, and Baudrillard has also said that religious language is one example which is used to control people and their behavior. You know that in a religious country like India, where religion influences our thoughts and our activities, we can well understand that what is importance and role played by religion in our everyday lives. Now, postmodernism rejects all forms of essentialism, because the modernists believe that there is a universal essence of everything. There is a human essence. And this essence is universal. It is common across all the human beings. They reject it. They say that any foundationalism, any essentialism is not a true version of reality. Because they believe that modernists do not represent the reality. They present a grand or a vision of world before us which is removed from the reality, or which is having very less connection with the reality. For example, Richard Rorty, another very notable postmodern thinker, argues that there is no universal human essence which is unchanging and possessing an intrinsic set of features. There is no universal human essence, which is common and which is unchanging, which is universal. And it goes against the fact that the human beings are plural. They are having different understanding. They are having different thought processes. According to P. McLaren, society is not only characterized by any social essence, but by the infinite play of discursive differences. So, not only at the level of individual, but at the level of society also we find that there is no social essence which is common. On the other hand, there are lots of evidences of the discursive practices reflecting the divergences in the society. So therefore, this fundamental point is coming again and again, that the modernists, they are divorced from the reality. They are not helping, or they have not helped in presenting or portraying the reality of the social, economic and political world in the way in which we should know. Because only when we are having knowledge of our real world, then only we are aware about our real issues. We can identify the discrimination and injustices which are present. And after that only we can raise our voice against it. But if we are not connected with the reality, we are living in an elusive world, then we cannot think of rising, or we cannot think of making our voices heard against the injustice, because we are not aware of that, because we are totally disconnected from the reality. Then, postmodernism considers culture as a social force and its importance in the cultural analysis of the social theory. Because culture provides us an identity. So, if you have to understand the plural nature of society, you have to understand the various differences in culture. So, culture has constituted a very important part of the postmodernist study. They have considered it as a social force, and how its analysis is important for any social theory. Then it is anti-foundational. It questions everything and considers everything as provisional. There is no foundational, or you can say there is no permanent theory. There is no single theory to explain anything. Everything is provisional. Nothing is permanent. And everything is changing also. Nothing is permanent, everything is changing. And it questions everything. It asks the citizens or the people to question. Questioning or critical mindset is an essential element of postmodernism, though here they are using the critical approach to question the central tenets of modernism. But whatever the thing, they are using a critical standpoint. And therefore, the next point is, it is a highly critical epistemology, hostile to any overarching philosophy or political doctrine. It's a critical epistemology because it is critical. It rose in reaction to modernity. It has challenged the forces of modernity, the way the modernity has developed. It has challenged, it has critiqued the various promises and objectives of modernity, which it failed to deliver. Various scholars who belong to the postmodern tradition, they have challenged the impact of modernity, whether in the cultural lives or in the economic lives or at the level of individual or in the social lives. And therefore, it is a critical epistemology. It criticizes, it raises question, and it is hostile to any overarching philosophy or grand narrative or meta-narrative or political doctrine. Then after understanding the truth, and then we have understood the meaning of the language and how it has been interpreted and understood by the postmodernist thinker, now we come to the third point, or the third important element of postmodernism, which is fragmentation, or this is the fourth element, which is fragmentation. Postmodernism is identified with fragmentation or differentiation or smaller units or micro units. They believe that there is no one truth but plurality of truth. Similarly, society is not a grand whole, but society consists of fragmented units distributed across the space and time. And they argue that our society is not only plural, having conflicting but also valid claims. So it is not that they are conflict, that means they are not valid. It is conflicting because they are having different interest, they are plural in nature, but at the same time, their claims are valid in nature. Now, another very important point when we are talking about the fragmentation or in fact fragmentation, we have to remember that postmodernists have rejected various binaries constructed by modernity. Now, one of the essential features of modernity has been creation of binaries, creation of multiple binaries, whether between man and woman, worker and boss, mass and elite, bourgeois and proletariat, man and nature, and so on. There are multiple binaries. And postmodernists argue that modernism, they reject the vast categories and shades which are actually present between the two extremes. So, always talking in terms of two extremes, it reduces our understanding or reduces our framework to look at multiple shades which are present and have not been noticed or ignored till now, which the postmodernists argue that they should also be recognized and taken note of. Now, the postmodernists, they criticize a Western notion of subject as male and white. Now, we know that the postmodernism, they have criticized multiple binaries which have been created by the modernist. And we have learned some of those binaries. And another binary which is important is subject and object dichotomy. And this subject has been elitist in nature because it was dominated by the Western male and that too Western white male. So therefore, these binaries have not helped in understanding the various diversities at the level of individual across the world. Similarly, postmodernists, they reject the Cartesian notion of self. Now, it is a philosophical concept which talks about the separation between mind and body. Here also you find that there is binary. There is a dualism where we are talking in terms of two different aspects of reality. So, this separation of human being into two aspects or two dimensions, mind and body, is a notion of self which has been developed by the modernity. Postmodernists have rejected the Cartesian notion of the self. So, therefore, what you see in this lecture is that we have discussed the important elements of postmodernism. First, we have discussed the notion of truth and how there cannot be one single notion of truth, but there is multiple notions of truth. Second, we have discussed the role of language, how language plays a very important role in manufacturing consent, in exercising dominance, in creating a particular version of reality. Then, we have seen that how media is playing a very important role in constructing certain images, in manipulating our thoughts. Then we have seen that how postmodernist rejects all forms of essentialism, It rejects essentialism not only at the level of individual but also at the level of society. Then how for the postmodernism culture is a very important force, how it is a highly critical epistemology, how it criticizes the central tenets of the process of modernism. And then we have seen the last and the most important feature is fragmentation. How we can understand our society or the reality of our society in a much more comprehensive and realistic manner if we adopt a fragmented approach to understanding our society. If we adopt a pluralistic approach to understand that different types of human beings occupying different positions, status, power in the society. So, fragmented approach is a very important way of understanding. So, with this, I come to the end of this lecture, but followed by certain questions which are based on the topics which we have covered. First is how postmodernist understands truth. Here in the lecture 1 as well as in the lecture 2, I have given you a detailed explanation about how truth has been understood by the modernist thinkers, by the Enlightenment thinkers, how the Enlightenment tradition have conceived truth, what are the features of the truth which has been underlined by the modernist thinkers, and what are those elements of understanding the notion of truth that has been criticized by the postmodernist thinker, and in place of the modernist notion of truth, what version of truth, what understanding of truth is given by the postmodernist thinkers. These are all the aspects which have been discussed in lecture 1 and 2. And when you attempt this question, you have to mention all these elements. Then the second is how media separates us from reality. I have given you one example to illustrate how media separates us from reality. The type of social situation or the type of social system, political system, which is portrayed in the various programs which is telecast on media, various platforms of media, I would like you to go and analyze them and find out whether really what Baudrillard is telling is true, that media is actually making us distant from our reality. It is not helping us in understanding the reality and what may be the reasons behind them. And the third is why, according to postmodernist, society cannot be understood in terms of binaries. You can take example of some of the binaries which we have mentioned, along with many others which you can find, and based on that you can answer why these constructs are not sufficient to understand the social reality and what are the important reasons behind them. And thirdly, if we try to understand society with the help of binaries, what are the consequences? How it is going to affect the multiple communities and groups who may not be recognized by these two binaries. And beside these questions, there are certain statements or questions I have given which I would like you to think upon and answer and build your own reasoning. The first is, can you suggest two ways by which language is used to control and manipulate in real life situation? Now, these will be based on your own understanding, your own experience, where you will try to find out how language is used to dominate. Second, do you think that media programs takes us far away from reality? Give some examples to support your answers based on the programs which you watch, whether it can be a TV serial or it can be a news analysis or it can be a web series, anything, or a film. You just watch it, or if you have watched it, just make an analysis that whether it is taking us far from the reality and how it is impacting your perspective towards looking the world. So, with that, we have come to the end of this lecture. I hope you have understood the various aspects, especially the elements of postmodernism. And in the next lecture, we will talk about how modernist or how the postmodernism has helped in understanding our society. With this, I come to the end. Thank you very much.